The convoy left him at the edge of the world and turned back without a word. 2 soldiers, 1 mule, a sack of millet that would last maybe 5 days. Kang Mu-hyul stood in snow up to his thighs and watched the riders vanish into the white curtain of falling ice. The decree in his coat pocket said he was appointed governor of Nungul settlement. Governor. You do not appoint a governor to a graveyard. You appoint a corpse. Lord Chogyul-bin and his allies wanted Mu-hyul dead, but they wanted clean hands. So they found a place where winter itself would do the killing. No blade required, just snow and silence, and a frozen body found in spring. If anyone found it at all. He pulled the millet off the mule and slung it over his shoulder. The animal was half dead already. Frost clung to its muzzle, and its legs shook with every step. He grabbed the rope and started walking north. The cold was not weather. It was a living thing. It crawled under his coat and pressed against his skin and squeezed the warmth out of his blood, 1 heartbeat at a time. Mu-hyul had survived border campaigns and eaten boot leather when supplies ran out. But this cold had weight. It had patience. It intended to kill him, and it had all the time in the world. He walked for 3 hours before he saw the first sign of Nungul. A fence post sticking out of a drift at an angle. Then a collapsed shed buried to the roofline. Then smoke. Thin and gray and barely visible, but it was smoke, and that meant someone was still alive. The settlement sat in a shallow valley between 2 ridges of black pine forest. 40 houses, maybe 30 still standing. The rest had buckled under snow or been stripped for firewood. This was not a village. This was a place waiting to finish dying. He descended the slope, and a dog appeared from behind a snow wall. Its ribs showed through matted fur. It did not bark. It did not have the energy. Doors creaked open. Faces appeared in the gaps. People emerged slowly, like animals from burrows. Gaunt, hollow, wrapped in stained rags. They stared at him, and at the mule, and at the sack, and he could read every thought. Another mouth to feed? Another useless official sent to watch them die? A man stepped forward, old, maybe 50, but he looked 70. Swollen hands cracked from frostbite, steady eyes. He said his name was Tubei, village elder. The word elder was generous. He was simply the one who had not died yet. Tubei looked at the decree and his expression did not change. He said the last man the province sent lasted 11 days. The one before that made it 9. Mu-hyul asked how many people remained. 112 at last count, but that was 8 days old. 3 more had died since. A woman, an infant, an old man who walked into the snow and sat against a tree and never got up. Mu-hyul asked about food. Tubei's jaw tightened. Millet for 6 days if rationed hard. Dried fish. Bark soup. 2 families eating boiled leather. Livestock gone. The last goat died 12 days ago. Hunting pointless. The game had vanished. Deer gone. Boar gone. Even rabbits. The forest was dead. A girl near the back of the crowd caught his attention. Young, arms crossed, expression hard, not defeated, angry. She looked at him the way you look at a man selling something you cannot afford. Her name was Se-hui, daughter of a hunter who went into the forest 2 months ago and never came back, feeding 3 siblings on bark soup and fury. Mu-hyul told Tubei he needed to see the storehouse before nightfall. Tubei stared at him. Every official before had gone straight to the warmest house and closed the door. This one wanted to see the storehouse. Inside the stone building, the shelves were nearly bare. A few sacks of millet, strips of dried fish hard as wood, pine nuts, half a jar of animal fat. Mu-hyul counted everything. 10 days at current consumption. After that, nothing. He stepped outside and looked toward the tree line. The great forest began a few hundred paces north. Massive black pines rising into gray sky, dark and dense and buried in snow. Tubei said the forest was cursed. 5 years ago, game was plentiful. Then the great winter began, and every year got worse. Now, hunters walked for days and found only empty tracks leading nowhere. Muhyol stared at the dark trees. Then it happened. A flicker at the edge of his vision, sharp, deliberate. The hunting system activated with a pulse only he could feel. A map materialized in his mind. The forest was not empty. Signatures of life scattered through the trees. Snow hares burrowed beneath a deadfall 400 paces northeast. A deer bedded in a pine thicket half a league deep. Fish holding beneath 2 feet of ice in a frozen stream. The game had not vanished. It had gone deep where no ordinary hunter could find it. But the system saw it all. A quest pulsed. Hunt. Bring meat. Feed the starving. He turned to Tubei and told him to gather every bow and spear and rope in the settlement. He was going into the forest at dawn. Tubei looked at him as if he had announced he would walk into a furnace. Every hunter who went out came back empty or did not come back at all. Muhyol walked to the house they assigned him, a small structure with a cracked door and ice on the walls. He built a fire and sat with his back against the wall. The system overlay glowed faintly. Hares northeast, deer north, fish under ice. Tomorrow he would bring something back, not because a system told him to, because 109 people outside this wall were starving, and he was done watching people die while men in warm fortresses decided who deserved to live. His fists tightened. The wind screamed outside. Muhyol did not sleep. He sharpened the one decent knife from the storehouse and waited for dawn. Muhyol rose before dawn. The fire had died to embers, and the cold had crept back into the walls. He could see his breath in the dark. He pulled on every layer he had and laced his boots tight and stepped outside. The sky was black. No stars. The clouds hung low and heavy with snow that had not yet fallen. The system overlay pulsed faintly at the edge of his vision. 3 signatures northeast. The hares. He had memorized their position before he closed his eyes last night. 400 paces into the forest, burrowed under a deadfall oak. He crossed the settlement in silence. No one was awake. The trenches between houses were empty, and the only sound was wind scraping across frozen rooftops. At the northern edge, he found the hunting gear Tubei had gathered. A short bow with a cracked limb, 6 arrows, 2 with chipped heads, a length of hemp rope stiff with frost, a skinning knife so dull it would barely cut hide. This was everything Nongol had. He tested the bow. The draw was weak, but it would serve at close range. He slung it over his shoulder and took the rope and the knife and walked toward the tree line. The first step into the great forest changed everything. The wind died. The trees stood so thick and tall that the snow between them was shallower, knee-deep instead of chest-deep. But the cold was worse. It settled into the bones like iron. The pines creaked overhead, and somewhere far off, something groaned. Ice expanding in the heartwood of ancient trees, the sound of a forest being crushed slowly by winter. The system guided him northeast, a thin golden line only he could see tracing a path through the trunks. He followed it. The snow was unmarked, no tracks, no sign of any living creature. He understood why the hunters came back empty. Without the system, this forest was a white tomb. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, just silence and cold, and the endless gray pillars of frozen pine. After 20 minutes, he reached the deadfall. A massive oak had fallen years ago, and its trunk lay half buried in snow. The system pulsed, 3 signatures directly beneath. He crouched and studied the ground. A faint depression in the snow near the root ball, droppings barely visible under fresh powder. He would not have seen them without looking. No hunter scanning from a distance would have noticed. He set to work in silence. He cleared a space and fashioned a simple snare from the rope, looped it around the narrowest gap between the trunk and the snowpack where the hares would bolt. Then he circled wide and came at the deadfall from the opposite side. He stamped his foot hard on the snow above the burrow. Nothing. He stamped again. An explosion of white. 3 hares burst from beneath the trunk in different directions. One hit the snare, and the rope snapped tight around its hind leg. The second darted left, and Muhyol lunged and caught it by the scruff with his bare hand. The third vanished into the trees. 2 hares, small, winter lean, maybe 3 pounds between them. It was nothing. It was everything. He tied them to his belt and checked the system. The deer signature was still there, half a league north, deeper into the forest. He looked at the sky through the canopy. Gray light was spreading. He had maybe 4 hours of daylight. The deer was risky. Deeper forest, heavier snow. And he had a bow with a cracked limb and arrows that might not punch through a winter hide. But 2 hares would feed maybe 10 people for 1 meal. He needed more. He started north. The forest grew denser. The pines gave way to older trees, oaks and elms, with trunks wider than a man could reach. Snow hung in heavy slabs on their branches and fell in sudden crashes that sounded like buildings collapsing. The system line led him through the gaps between drifts and around patches of ice where a stream had frozen mid-flow. He moved carefully. A twisted ankle out here meant death. After 40 minutes, the golden line slowed and pulsed brighter. Close. He crouched behind a fallen log and scanned the thicket ahead. At first, he saw nothing. Then, movement. A twitch of brown against white. The deer was bedded in a hollow between 2 young pines. A doe. Thin, but alive. She had scraped away snow to reach frozen moss beneath, and her muzzle was dusted with ice crystals. Muhyol nocked an arrow. The bow creaked in the cold. The deer's ears swiveled. He had 1 shot. The cracked limb meant the draw was uneven. He would have to get closer. He circled downwind. The snow crunched under his boots no matter how carefully he stepped. He stopped behind a pine trunk 15 paces from the deer. This was as close as he would get. He drew the bow. The limb groaned. The deer lifted her head. He released. The arrow flew slightly left and struck the doe in the neck behind the jaw. She leaped up and staggered 3 steps and collapsed into the snow. He was on her in seconds. The skinning knife was dull, but he found the artery and finished it quick. Steam rose from the wound into the frozen air. He knelt in the snow beside the carcass and breathed. His hands were shaking. Not from cold, from the raw electric fact that he had just killed the first large game anyone from Nungle had seen in months. The doe weighed maybe 90 pounds. Getting her back would be brutal. He cut 2 straight branches from a young pine and lashed them together with rope to make a crude drag frame. He rolled the carcass onto it and tied it down and started pulling. The way back was longer. Dragging 90 pounds through knee-deep snow turned every step into a battle. His shoulders burned, and his legs ached, and sweat froze on his face. But he kept moving. The system overlay showed the settlement as a faint cluster of warm signatures to the south. He aimed for them. He broke through the tree line as the sun reached its highest point behind the clouds. A pale disk of light, barely visible through the gray. The settlement appeared ahead, and he dragged the deer down the slope toward the first houses. Tubi saw him first. The old man had been standing at the northern edge, staring into the forest, waiting. He saw the shape coming through the snow. A man pulling something large. His mouth opened and no sound came out. Then he turned and shouted. People came out of their houses. They stood in the trenches and stared. Muhyol dragged the deer into the center of the settlement and dropped the rope. 2 hairs on his belt, a doe on the frame, blood on the snow. Silence. Then a woman in the front began to cry. Not grief, something else. A child tugged at its mother's sleeve and pointed at the deer. Tubi walked to the carcass and put his hand on its flank, as if making sure it was real. He looked up at Muhyol and his cracked lips moved. He said he had hunted these forests for 40 winters. He said he thought the forest was dead. Muhyol told him to get the knife sharpened and start butchering. There were people to feed. By nightfall, Nungol had meat, real meat, not bark soup, not boiled leather. Venison cut into strips and boiled in iron pots over every fire in the settlement. The smell drifted between houses, and people sat together for the first time in weeks and ate in silence, with tears running down their faces. Seihui watched from her doorway. She did not join the others, but she ate the portion Tube brought her, and her 3 siblings ate theirs. And for the first time in a month, no one in that house went to sleep with an empty stomach. Muhyol sat alone by his fire and studied the system. New signatures had appeared. The act of hunting had sharpened something. The overlay reached further now. He could see a cluster of boar 2 leagues northwest, a second deer herd deeper in the forest. The quest updated. First hunt complete. New objective. Establish consistent food supply. The numbers in his head were clear. 1 deer fed the settlement for 2 days. He needed to hunt every day. And he needed more than a cracked bow and a dull knife. He needed hunters. Muhyol woke to the smell of smoke and old venison. The settlement was stirring earlier than before. He could hear movement outside, voices. Something had shifted overnight. Yesterday, these people had been waiting to die. Today, they were waiting to see if the new lord would go into the forest again. He did. But first, he needed to solve the equipment problem. The cracked bow had survived 1 hunt. It would not survive 10. He found Gomtol in a low stone building near the eastern edge of the settlement. The forge was cold, no coal for weeks. But the big man was sitting on a stool, wrapping sinew around a broken axe handle, with hands that moved like they had done this 10,000 times. Gomtol looked up when Muhyol entered. 50 years old, broad as a door, face like a stone cliff.
He did not greet the new lord. He just waited.
Muhyol set the 2 hair pelts and the deer hide on the workbench. He told Gomtol what he needed. A new bow, arrows with proper heads, snares, traps, skinning tools, everything built from what the forest and the hunt provided. Bone and antler for arrowheads, sinew for bowstrings, hide for grips and lashings. Gomtol looked at the materials and then at Muhyol. He said he could build all of it, but he needed more. More hide, more bone, more sinew. 1 deer was not enough to equip a hunting operation. Muhyol told him he would get more. He took the cracked bow and his 6 arrows and went back into the forest. The system led him northwest this time. The boar signatures he had seen last night pulsed 2 leagues deep, too far for today. But the overlay showed something closer. A cluster of ptarmigan roosting in a snow-covered thicket half a league west. Small game, but every kill counted. He reached the thicket in 30 minutes. The birds were huddled together in a depression beneath low branches, white feathers against white snow, invisible to the naked eye. The system outlined them in faint gold. He killed 4 with 3 arrows. The bow held. On the way back, the system flickered and a new signature appeared. South of his position. Close. Not prey, a predator. Wolf. The signature was red instead of gold, moving parallel to him through the trees. Muhyul stopped and nocked an arrow. He stood motionless and watched the red marker drift through the overlay. The wolf was tracking him. It had smelled the blood on his hands and the birds on his belt. He waited. The marker circled wide and then stopped. Then it moved away. Northwest. Back into the deep forest. The wolf was alone. A lone wolf in winter meant it had been driven from its pack, or its pack was dead. Either way, it was desperate, and it knew the forest had a new hunter in it. He returned to Nungal with 4 ptarmigan and a warning in his gut. Wolves meant competition, and wolves that tracked humans meant trouble coming. He gave the birds to Tube and went to find Sehui. She was behind her house splitting frozen wood with an axe that was too heavy for her. She swung it with both hands, and the log cracked apart, and she grabbed the pieces and stacked them without pausing. Muhyul watched her for a moment. The way she moved, efficient, no wasted motion, strong despite the weeks of hunger. She noticed him and stopped. Her expression was the same as the first day, hard, suspicious. He told her he needed hunters, people who could move through deep snow and handle a bow and follow instructions without panic. She asked why he was telling her. He said because she was the only person in the settlement who looked angry instead of defeated. Anger was useful. She stared at him for a long time. Then she set the axe down and said her father had taught her to shoot before she could read.
She said she had hunted with him every autumn since she was 8. She said the last time she went into the forest, she found his bow frozen in the snow with no tracks leading away from it. Just the bow and the snow and nothing else. Muhyul said nothing for a moment. Then he told her he could find game where others saw only emptiness. He did not explain how. He just said that if she came with him tomorrow, she would see. She agreed, not with enthusiasm, with the grim practicality of a woman who had 3 mouths to feed and no other options. That afternoon, Muhyul and Tube did a full count of the settlement. 106 people. 3 more had been wrong in the earlier count. Dead before Muhyul arrived, but no one had updated the number. Of the 106, only 31 were adults capable of physical labor. The rest were children or elderly, or too weakened by starvation to stand for long. Of the 31, maybe 8 had any hunting experience.
Muhyul chose 4 for the first hunting party. Sehui, a man named Dalsu who had been a trapper before the Great Winter. 2 brothers called Junwan and Junha, who were young and strong enough to haul game through snow. Tube wanted to come. Muhyul told him no. He needed the old man in the settlement. Someone had to manage rationing and watch the perimeter. Tube understood, but the disappointment on his face was visible. That evening, Gomtol presented his first piece of work, a new bowstring made from deer sinew, stronger than the old hemp cord. He had restrung the cracked bow and reinforced the damaged limb with strips of antler lashed tight with wet hide that would dry hard as iron. It was ugly. It was functional. Muhyul tested the draw, smooth and even, twice the power of before. He nodded at Gomtol, and the big man shrugged as if he had done nothing worth noting. The settlement ate ptarmigan soup that night, thin but warm and real. Muhyul sat by his fire and studied the system. The overlay was sharper now, more detailed. He could see individual animal tracks rendered as faint lines through the forest. Migration patterns emerging. The boar northwest had not moved. The deer herd had shifted slightly east, and far to the north, at the very edge of the system range, something large pulsed once and vanished. A signature bigger than anything he had seen, there and then gone.
He stared at the empty space where it had been. The deep forest held something. He was not ready for it yet. Dawn broke gray and windless, a rare mercy. Muhyol gathered his 4 hunters at the northern edge of the settlement before first light. Sehui carried her father's old bow that she had restrung herself overnight. Dalsu had a bundle of snare wire and rope coiled over his shoulder. The brothers Junwan and Junha carried nothing but axes and the stubborn endurance of youth. Muhyol looked at them. 4 half-starved people in worn furs standing at the edge of a dead forest.
This was his army. He told them the plan. They would move northeast to a ravine the system had marked overnight. Boar tracks converged there, a feeding ground where the animals dug through snow for frozen roots. He did not mention the system. He said he had read the signs in the snow yesterday, tracks and droppings and broken branches, the old language of the forest. Dalsu nodded. He understood tracking. The others just followed. They entered the forest in single file. Muhyol led. The system line glowed gold ahead of him, threading between the trunks. He set a pace that was fast enough to cover ground, but slow enough that no one burned out. Snow was knee-deep under the canopy. Every step required effort. Within 10 minutes, Junha was breathing hard. Within 20, Dalsu's face was red and his limp had worsened. Old injuries from years of trapping in the cold. Muhyol slowed without comment. After 30 minutes, they reached the ravine, a long, shallow cut in the earth where a summer stream once ran. Now it was a trench of packed snow between steep banks lined with exposed roots. The system showed 4 signatures at the far end. Boar. Muhyol crouched and pointed. Fresh tracks in the snow leading down into the ravine. Deep hoofprints. Snapped roots where something had been digging. Dalsu's eyes widened. He whispered that he had checked this ravine 2 weeks ago and found nothing. Muhyol told him the animals had moved back. He said the deep forest still held game, but it shifted constantly. You had to know where to look each day, not each season. He positioned his team. Dalsu set snares across the narrowest point of the ravine, where the banks were steep enough that a running animal would have no choice but to pass through. Junwan and Junha circled wide to the far end. Their job was simple. Make noise. Drive the boar south toward the snares. Muhyol and Sehui took positions on the banks above the kill zone. Bows ready. He looked at Sehui. She had knocked an arrow without being told, and her eyes were fixed on the ravine below. Calm, focused. Her father had taught her well. He gave the signal, a sharp whistle that cut through the cold air. Silence. Then, from the far end of the ravine, a crash of noise as the brothers began shouting and beating trees with their axes. The forest erupted. 4 boar exploded from the undergrowth and charged south through the ravine. Black shapes against white snow. Massive. Winter boar were thick with fat and dense muscle built for surviving the cold. The lead boar hit the first snare and the rope caught its foreleg and snapped tight. The animal screamed, a sound like metal tearing. It thrashed and the rope held. Dalsu's knots were good. The second boar veered right and tried to scramble up the bank. Muhyol drew and released. The arrow struck behind the shoulder, and the boar tumbled back into the ravine, kicking. The third came straight through the kill zone at full speed. Sehui's arrow took it in the neck. Clean. The animal ran 10 more paces and collapsed. The fourth broke left and crashed through a gap in the snare line and vanished into the trees. 3 bore down. Muhyol slid down the bank and finished the snared one with his knife. The ravine was chaos, steam rising from the bodies, blood dark against snow. The brothers came running from the north, breathing hard with wild eyes. Junwan stared at the 3 carcasses and his mouth hung open. He said he had not seen this much meat in one place since he was a child.
Dalsu knelt beside the boar Seihui had killed and examined the arrow wound. He looked at her and said nothing, but the respect in his eyes was clear. Seihui pulled her arrow from the carcass and wiped it on the snow. Her hands were steady. Muhyol checked the system. The fourth boar had fled northwest. Its signature was moving fast and fading. Let it go. 3 was enough. But the hunt was only half done. Now came the hardest part. 3 winter boar weighed over 500 pounds combined. They had to drag them half a league through snow back to Nungal, with no sled, no horse, no mule, just 5 people and rope. They gutted the animals in the ravine to reduce weight. Muhyol showed them how to cut fast and clean. Save the organs. Heart and liver and kidneys were food. Intestines could be cleaned for casing. Nothing wasted. They fashioned drag lines from rope and branches, and each person took a load. Muhyol hauled the largest boar alone. The rope cut into his shoulders, and every step was a fight against the snow dragging at the carcass beneath it. They moved in silence, no energy for talk. The forest watched them with its cold indifference. Halfway back, Seihui fell. Her legs gave out, and she dropped to her knees in the snow. Weeks of starvation had eaten her strength down to nothing, and raw will was not enough to replace muscle. Muhyol stopped. He tied her load to his own and pulled both. The rope bit deeper. His shoulders screamed. He did not stop. They broke through the tree line 2 hours later. The settlement saw them coming. 5 figures dragging dark shapes across the snow. Tube was the first to run toward them. Then others followed. Men and women wading through the drifts to help pull. The 3 boar were laid out in the center of Nungal, and people gathered around them in silence that lasted a full minute before it broke into noise. Voices, hands reaching out to touch the carcasses, children pressing close to stare. 500 pounds of meat and fat and hide and bone. Enough to feed the settlement for nearly a week. Muhyol stood apart and watched. His shoulders were raw under his coat. His legs trembled. But the system pulsed with completion. Quest updated. First group hunt successful. Hunting party established. New skills unlocked. Trap construction. Group coordination. He looked at Seihui. She was sitting on a log with her bow across her knees, watching the butchering begin. She caught his eye and gave him a single nod. No smile, no words, just acknowledgement from one hunter to another. That was enough. The boar changed everything. For 5 days, Nungal ate. Real meals. Boar meat roasted over open fires. Rendered fat spread on bark bread. Bone broth thick enough to warm a body from the inside out. Children who had forgotten the taste of meat chewed strips of it with wide eyes. The elderly who had been too weak to leave their houses sat upright for the first time in weeks. Muhyol did not rest. He hunted every day, sometimes alone, sometimes with Seihui or Dalsu. The system kept expanding. Each successful hunt sharpened the overlay and pushed its range further into the forest. He could now see signatures nearly 2 leagues out. Deer, hare, ptarmigan, fox. The forest was not dead. It was hiding. And Muhyol was learning its secrets, 1 kill at a time. On the 6th day, he called a meeting in the storehouse. Tube, Seihui, Gomtol, Dalsu, the brothers, everyone who mattered. He laid out the numbers. 106 mouths. Current meat supply would last 3 more days. Hunting brought enough to stay ahead, but barely. 1 bad day, 1 blizzard that kept them inside, 1 injury in the forest, and they were back to starvation. They needed a system. Not his system, a human one. He divided the work. Hunting parties would rotate.
2 teams of 3 working alternate days so no one burned out. Dalsu would manage trap lines. Permanent snares set along game trails the system revealed to Muhyol. He described the locations as places he had scouted. No one questioned it. Sehui would lead the second hunting team once she had enough experience. The brothers would focus on hauling. Every carcass needed to be dragged back, and that work broke bodies faster than the hunt itself. Gomtal would process everything. Every hide scraped and stretched, every bone saved, every sinew pulled and dried, fat rendered into tallow for lamps and cooking, nothing thrown away, nothing wasted. He assigned 10 women to work under Gomtal's direction, cutting meat into strips for smoking, preparing hides, sewing winter clothing from the pelts that were piling up. The settlement needed warmth as much as food. Half the people in Nungal were wearing rags that let the cold pass through like water. Tubai listened to all of this with his arms folded. When Muhyol finished, the old man was quiet for a long time. Then he said that in 40 years, no one sent from the south had ever organized anything. They came and gave orders and took what little the settlement had and left or died. This was different. He did not say thank you. He said he would make it work. That was worth more. The trap lines went up the next day. Dalsu turned out to be a genius with snares. He could read the terrain and understand where an animal would step before the animal itself knew. Muhyol showed him the trails, and Dalsu did the rest. Within 3 days, the trap lines were pulling in 2 or 3 hares daily without anyone entering the deep forest. Passive food, reliable, small but constant. Gomtol's workshop became the second heart of the settlement after the storehouse. The big man worked from dawn to dark. He built 3 new bows from ashwood reinforced with bone and sinew, stronger than anything Nungal had seen. He fashioned arrowheads from boar tusk and deer antler, sharp enough to punch through winter hide at 30 paces. He built a smoking rack from green wood and stone, and the first batch of smoked venison went into the storehouse on the 8th day after Muhyol's arrival. Preserved meat, food that would last weeks instead of days. The smell of the smoking rack drifted across the settlement, and people stopped to stare at it. Some of them cried.
They had forgotten what a future looked like. Sehui took to hunting like she had been born for it. Her eye was better than Muhyol's at distance. She could put an arrow through a gap in the trees that he would not have attempted. What she lacked was the instinct for where game would be. She followed his lead on tracking without complaint and watched how he moved through the forest and where he chose to stop and listen. She did not know about the system. She thought he was the best tracker she had ever seen. In a way, she was right. On the 10th day, the weather turned. The sky went black at noon, and the wind came from the north like a wall of knives. Blizzard. The worst since Muhyol's arrival. He ordered everyone inside and sealed the doors. The snow fell so thick you could not see your hand at arm's length. The temperature dropped until water froze inside the houses. For 2 days, the storm buried Nungal. Drifts climbed past the windows. The paths between houses vanished. The world outside became a white scream of wind and ice. But inside the houses, people ate smoked meat and boar jerky, and drank bone broth heated over fires fed with wood they had stockpiled. No one starved. No one froze. When the blizzard broke on the 3rd day, and Muhyol dug out his door and climbed into the pale morning light, he saw something that stopped him. Tubei was already outside. The old man stood in the waist-deep snow between the houses, and he was laughing. Not loudly, a quiet, broken sound that came from somewhere deep. He told Muhyol that last winter, a storm like this killed 9 people. The winter before that, 11. This time, no one died. Not one. Muhyol looked at the storehouse, still stocked. The trap lines would need resetting, but the smoking rack had enough preserved meat for another week. They had weathered the storm. The system pulsed. A new quest appeared. The blizzard had driven fresh game south from the deep forest.
Signatures clustered at the tree line. Deer, a dozen at least, pushed out of their shelter by the storm and huddled together for warmth, exhausted, vulnerable. He gathered his hunters. The deer herd stood at the tree line like ghosts. 12 animals huddled in a tight cluster beneath the pines. Snow clung to their backs and their heads hung low. The blizzard had driven them south from the deep forest, and they were too exhausted to flee. Muhyal counted them through the system overlay, 12 gold signatures pulsing faintly in the gray morning light. He had never seen this many in one place. The storm had done what no hunter could. It had pushed the prey to him. He positioned his teams fast. Seihui took Junwan and circled east through the trees to cut off the herd's escape route back into the deep forest. Dalsu and Junha moved west with snare lines to block the ravine. Muhyal went straight in alone. The plan was simple. He would push the herd south toward open ground where the snow was deepest.
Panicked deer would flounder in chest-high drifts. The hunters on the flanks would pick them off with arrows. He moved through the trees in silence. 50 paces from the herd, he stopped behind a thick pine and nocked an arrow. The lead doe raised her head. Her nostrils flared. She had caught something on the wind. Muhyal stepped out from cover and shouted. The herd exploded. 12 deer launched in every direction, like a brown wave breaking against white snow. The lead doe bolted north, back toward the deep forest. 3 followed her. The rest scattered south and east, exactly as planned. Muhyal released his arrow, and a young buck stumbled and went down in the snow. He knocked again and tracked a second deer plowing through the drifts. The arrow caught it in the ribs, and it collapsed 20 paces later. From the east, he heard the snap of Seihui's bow. Then again. 2 more deer fell. The animals that reached the western ravine hit Dalsu's snare line, and 2 tangled in the ropes.
Junho was on them with his axe before they could thrash free. In less than 3 minutes, 6 deer lay dead or dying in the snow. 6 more had escaped into the forest. Muhyal walked between the fallen animals and finished each one quickly. No suffering, clean kills where he could manage it, the knife work where he could not. Steam rose from the carcasses into the frozen air, and the snow around them turned dark. 6 deer, maybe 400 pounds of usable meat, plus hides, plus bone and sinew and fat. This was not a hunt, this was a harvest. The haul back took the entire day. Every able body in Nungol came out to help drag, even the older children, even women who could barely lift a rope. They formed lines and pulled the carcasses through the snow one at a time. By nightfall, all 6 deer were in the settlement. Gomtol's team worked through the night, butchering, skinning, separating fat from meat. The smoking rack ran at full capacity, and a second one was built from salvaged wood. The storehouse filled. For the first time since Muhyal's arrival, the shelves were not empty. Strips of smoked venison hung from the ceiling in dark red rows. Rendered fat filled every available jar. Hides stretched on frames along the inner wall. Muhyal stood in the storehouse and counted. At current consumption, with careful rationing, they had enough food for 3 weeks. 3 weeks. The number hit him like warm water. For the first time since he arrived, the math worked. They were not just surviving day to day. They were building a margin, a buffer between life and death that grew with every hunt. That night, the settlement gathered in the largest house. All 106 of them packed into a space meant for 20. Body heat alone raised the temperature until the ice on the walls began to melt. Tube stood and spoke. He said that Nungol had been dying for 3 years. Every winter worse. Every spring, fewer people. He said he had accepted that this would be the last winter, that by spring, the settlement would be empty. He looked at Muhyal across the crowded room. He said, "One man changed that.
Muhyol shook his head. He told them one man did not do anything. One man killed a deer. A community survived a blizzard. He pointed at Gomtol, who had not slept in 30 hours and was still working bone into arrowheads. He pointed at Sehui, who had killed 2 deer with 2 arrows that morning. He pointed at Dalsu, whose trap lines caught food while everyone slept. He pointed at the brothers, who had hauled 3 times their own weight through snow without complaint. He told them the forest was not their enemy. The forest was their lifeline, and they were learning to use it. The room was quiet. Then Junha grinned and said, "The Lord talked like a general, but hunted like a madman, and he would follow both into any blizzard." The laughter that broke out was rough and raw and real. Muhyol did not laugh, but something in his chest loosened for the first time in weeks. The system pulsed that night with a notification he had not seen before. Territory established. Nungal recognized as active hunting settlement. New tier unlocked. Large game detection range expanded. And at the far northern edge of the overlay, that massive signature flickered again. Huge, ancient, deep in the heart of the great forest. It pulsed twice and vanished. Something was watching him learn to hunt, and it was waiting. Winter tightened its grip. The days grew shorter. By the 3rd week of Muhyol's arrival, the sun barely cleared the southern ridge before sinking again. 4 hours of gray light. The rest was darkness and cold so deep that spit froze before it hit the ground. But Nungal was changing. Gomtol finished the first set of proper winter clothing. Boarhide coats lined with rabbit fur. Deerskin boots stuffed with dried grass for insulation. Mittens stitched from layered pelts with sinew thread. He distributed them to the hunters first, then the children. Then everyone else. For the first time in months, people walked outside without shaking. The cold still bit, but it no longer killed on contact. Muhyol organized work crews. Men and women who were too weak or unskilled to hunt were put to other tasks, clearing snow from rooftops before the weight collapsed the structures, reinforcing walls with packed snow and ice that acted as insulation, cutting and stacking firewood from dead trees at the forest edge, digging out the 3 abandoned houses on the eastern side and making them livable again. The settlement stopped looking like a graveyard and started looking like a place where people intended to stay alive. Sehui led her first solo hunt on the 22nd day. Muhyol gave her a direction, northeast. He described the terrain and told her where the game trails ran and where to set up. He had pulled all of this from the system, but to Sehui, it sounded like a man who had spent weeks mapping every inch of the forest on foot. She took Junwan and Dalsu and went out before dawn. Muhyol stayed in the settlement. He spent the morning with Gomtol, working on a project that had been forming in his mind for days. A proper sled. Built from pine runners and lashed together with hide rope. Light enough for 2 people to pull. Strong enough to carry a full deer carcass. The drag system they had been using was destroying their bodies. Every haul took hours and left the hunters spent for the next day. A sled would cut the work in half. Gomtol studied the design Muhyol scratched into the dirt floor of the workshop. He grunted and said, it would work if the runners were waxed with tallow. He started building. Sehui returned at midday with 2 hares and a young doe. She was breathing hard and her face was flushed, but her eyes were bright. She reported the hunt with clipped efficiency. Found the trails where Muhyol said they would be. Set up downwind, waited. The doe came through at mid-morning. Clean shot at 20 paces. The hares were from Dalsu's snares, set along the same trail. Muhyol nodded. She did not need praise. She needed to know the system worked without him. It did. That afternoon, a sound came from the south that no one in Nungal had heard in months. Voices. Distant, carried on the wind.
Tubei heard them first, and his face went pale. Visitors in winter meant one of two things: trade or trouble, and no one traded this far north anymore. Muhyul climbed the southern ridge and looked down the slope. 3 figures moving through the snow, slowly, stumbling. One of them fell, and the other 2 stopped to pull the person up. Not raiders, not soldiers, refugees. They reached the settlement an hour later. A man, a woman, a child no older than 7. The man's name was Yong-su. He said they were from a settlement called Baruhan, 3 days south. Baruhan was dead. The last of the food ran out a week ago. The elder decided to send the remaining survivors in different directions to find help. Yong-su had taken his wife and son north because he had heard a rumor. Someone in Nungal was hunting. Someone had meat. Muhyul looked at the 3 of them. The woman could barely stand. The child's lips were blue, and his fingers were white with frostbite. Yong-su himself had the hollow stare of a man who had walked 3 days through snow on nothing but desperation. Muhyul brought them inside and fed them. Venison broth first, slowly. A starving body could not handle solid food immediately. The child ate with both hands shaking, and his mother held him and rocked back and forth with her eyes closed. Tubei pulled Muhyul aside. His expression was worried. He said the food supply was stable, but it was calculated for 106 people. Every new mouth changed the math. And if Baruhan was dead, there could be more refugees coming. Muhyul knew he was right. The numbers were clear. 3 weeks of food for 106. Every additional person shortened that window. But he also knew something Tubei did not. The system was still growing. Every hunt expanded its range and precision. He could find game faster and deeper than before. The forest had more to give. He told Tubei to feed them and find them a house. Tubei hesitated. Then he nodded and went. Yong-su recovered enough to talk properly by evening. He told Muhyul about Baruhan. 40 households at its peak, down to 12 when the food ran out. The settlement had no hunters left. The last 2 went into the forest a month ago and never returned. The elder sent groups of survivors east and west and south. Yong-su went north because it was the direction nobody else chose. Nobody believed there was anything alive north of Baruhan. Muhyul asked how many survivors Baruhan had sent out in total. Yong-su said maybe 30, in groups of 3 or 4. Scattered across the frozen north with no food and no destination. Just walking until they found help or died. Muhyul sat with that number in his head. 30 people wandering the snow. Some would die. Some might find other settlements. And some would hear the same rumor Yong-su heard and come north to Nungal. The math was about to change. He went to the storehouse and recounted everything. Then he sat down and planned the next week of hunts. Bigger targets, deeper forest, more risk, more reward. The system showed him the boar had returned to the northwest ravine. A new herd of deer grazed 2 leagues northeast. And beneath the ice of the frozen river, a school of fish held in the deep channel waiting for spring that might never come. He would need every one of them. The fish changed the equation. Muhyul had been watching the river signature on the system overlay for days. A frozen channel half a league east of the settlement. 2 feet of solid ice on top. Beneath it, a deep pool where the current slowed and fish clustered in the dark water, waiting out the winter. Trout, maybe 40 or 50 of them, packed into a space no larger than a house. No one in Nungal had tried ice fishing. The river had frozen so thick that people assumed everything beneath was dead. They were wrong. Muhyul took Dalsu and the brothers to the river at dawn. The system marked the exact spot where the fish held. A bend in the channel where a rock formation created a natural pool. He pointed at the ice and told Dalsu to cut. The old trapper looked at him like he was mad. Then he shrugged and swung his axe.
It took an hour to cut through the ice. 2 feet of solid, frozen water. The axe rang with every strike, and chips of ice flew like sparks. When the blade finally broke through, dark water welled up through the hole, and Junha jumped back as if something would climb out. Muhyul widened the hole to the size of a barrel. Then he lay flat on the ice and looked down into the black water. He could see them. Silver shapes drifting in the current. Dozens. The system overlay confirmed. 43 fish in the pool. He fashioned a crude spear from a straight branch and a bone point. The water distorted position, so he had to aim low. His first thrust missed. The second grazed a trout and sent the school scattering. He waited. 5 minutes. 10. The fish settled back into their holding pattern. He struck again and pinned a fat trout against the river bottom. He pulled it out, thrashing and silver and alive. The brothers stared at it as if he had pulled gold from the earth. They caught 19 fish that day. Muhyul speared 11. Dalsu figured out the technique by the 5th attempt and landed 8. Junwan tried and fell headfirst into the hole and had to be dragged out soaking wet and cursing. They carried the fish back in a hide sack, and the settlement gathered to stare. Fresh fish in the dead of winter. Gomtal smoked half of them immediately. The rest went into a broth pot that fed 50 people that evening. Muhyul posted Junha at the fishing hole with instructions to keep it clear of ice. A permanent food source, passive, reliable, one less variable in the survival equation. The next morning, 5 more refugees arrived, 2 men and 3 women from a settlement even further south than Baruhan. They had walked for 5 days. One of the women had lost 3 toes to frostbite. They had heard the rumor too. Nungal had food. Muhyul fed them and assigned them houses. The population was now 114. Tubei's worry deepened, but he said nothing. The old man trusted Muhyul's hunting, but the numbers kept growing, and trust had limits. On the 28th day, Muhyul went deep, deeper than he had gone before. The system had been showing him a cluster of signatures 2.5 leagues north. Large game, boar or bigger. He took Seihui and left before dawn. They moved fast through the familiar territory near the settlement and slowed as they entered unknown forest. The trees here were older, taller, trunks so wide that 2 men could hide behind one. The snow was thinner under the dense canopy, but the cold was savage. Every breath burned. Seihui moved well. She had gained weight in the last 2 weeks, and her endurance had returned. She kept pace without complaint, and her eyes scanned the forest constantly. A real hunter now, not a survivor pretending. After 2 hours, the system line turned sharply west and descended into a broad valley Muhyul had never seen. A frozen lake sat at the bottom, surrounded by dense pine and birch. And on the far shore, the system showed the signatures. Not boar. Elk. 3 massive elk grazing on frozen brush at the water's edge. Muhyul had never hunted elk. The system overlay pulsed with new information. Elk. Adult male. Estimated weight 350 pounds. Adult female. Estimated weight 280 pounds. Juvenile male. Estimated weight 190 pounds. Total estimated yield over 500 pounds of usable meat, plus hides thick enough for heavy winter gear, plus bones dense enough for tools and weapons. 1 successful elk hunt would feed Nungal for 2 weeks. Seihui crouched beside him on the ridge above the lake and looked down at the animals. Her breath caught. She had never seen elk this far south. The great winter had pushed them out of the deep mountains and into the lower forest. She whispered that her father had hunted elk once when she was a child. He came back with a bowl so large it took 6 men to carry it. He told her elk were the kings of the forest,
and you did not hunt them without respect. Muhyul studied the terrain. The lake was open ground, no cover. The elk would see them coming from 200 paces. The surrounding forest was too dense for a clear shot. They needed to draw the animals into a position where arrows could reach them. He spent 30 minutes circling the lake with Sehui. The system tracked the elk's movement in real time. The bull was alert, head up, ears turning. He knew something was in the forest. The cow grazed calmly. The juvenile stayed close to her. Muhyul found what he needed on the eastern shore, a narrow gap between two rock outcrops where the forest met the lake. If the elk fled east, they would pass through that gap at close range. He positioned Sehui at the gap with instructions. Wait. Do not move. Do not shoot until the bull is past you. Take the cow. One shot, behind the shoulder. Then he circled back to the western shore and stepped out onto the ice. The bull saw him immediately. Its head snapped up and its body tensed. Muhyul walked toward them slowly across the frozen lake. Not running, not threatening. Just a figure moving across the ice. The bull stamped. The cow raised her head. Then the bull turned and bolted east along the shore. The cow followed. The juvenile followed her. They ran exactly where Muhyul needed them to go. He heard the snap of Sehui's bow from across the lake. Then silence. Then a crash as something large fell in the trees. He ran, slipping on the ice, scrambling through the snow at the shore. He found Sehui standing over the cow, her arrow buried to the fletching behind the left shoulder. Perfect shot. The bull and juvenile had vanished into the forest. One elk, 280 pounds of meat. The biggest single kill since Muhyul arrived in Nungol. Getting it back would take everything they had. Muhyul marked the location on the system, and they returned to the settlement for help. He came back with 8 people and the new sled Gomtol had finished. Even with the sled, it took 5 hours to haul the elk home. But when the carcass arrived in Nungol, dragged on pine runners through the last light of the short winter day, the settlement erupted. People ran out of houses. Children followed the sled through the paths. Gomtol took one look at the elk hide and his eyes widened. He said this hide alone was worth more than everything he had worked with so far. Thick, dense, perfect for heavy winter coats. Muhyul looked at the storehouse inventory that night. Food for 3 weeks, even with 114 mouths. The equation was holding, but the system showed him something else. At the very edge of his expanded range, that massive signature pulsed again, closer than before. It had moved south, toward him. Whatever lived in the heart of the great forest was no longer just watching. It was approaching. The wolves came on the 30th night. Muhyul had been tracking the lone wolf on the system for days. The red signature that had followed him on his second hunt. It had been circling the settlement at a distance, watching, learning. Now it was not alone. The system showed 7 red signatures approaching from the northwest in a loose formation, a pack. The lone wolf had found others, or others had found it. Either way, 7 hungry predators were moving toward the one place in the frozen north that smelled like food. Muhyul woke Sehui and Dalsu and the brothers. He told them what was coming. Not a guess. He said he had seen tracks on yesterday's hunt. Fresh wolf prints converging from the northwest. The pack was heading for the settlement's meat stores. They could smell the smoking rack from leagues away. They armed themselves and took positions on the northern perimeter. Muhyul placed torches in the snow at intervals. Fire was the first defense. Wolves feared flame more than blades. Sehui climbed onto the roof of the storehouse with her bow, best vantage point in the settlement. Dalsu and the brothers guarded the eastern and western approaches. Tubei gathered the remaining adults and armed them with whatever they could hold. Axes, knives, sharpened sticks.
114 people huddled in their houses and listened to the darkness. The wolves arrived an hour before dawn. Muhyol heard them before the system confirmed it. A low sound at the edge of hearing. Not quite a howl. A steady rising note that vibrated in the chest and turned the blood cold. The pack leader appeared at the tree line first. A massive gray shape that paused at the boundary between forest and open ground. Its eyes caught the torchlight and reflected it back as twin points of yellow fire. It was the biggest wolf Muhyol had ever seen. Scarred, lean. Winter had stripped it down to muscle and hunger and killing instinct. The others materialized behind it. 6 wolves spread in a crescent formation. They did not charge. They studied. They looked at the torches and the figures standing in the snow, and they calculated. Wolves were not mindless. They assessed risk and reward with a precision that most humans could not match. The lead wolf took 3 steps forward. Muhyol drew his bow. He did not want to kill it. Wolves kept the forest in balance, and a dead pack meant prey populations would spike and crash. But he would not lose a single person or a single pound of stored meat. He released the arrow. It struck the snow 2 feet in front of the lead wolf, a warning shot. The wolf did not flinch. It looked at the arrow and then at Muhyol, and something passed between them. Recognition. One hunter acknowledging another. Then the wolf turned. The pack turned with it. 7 gray shapes melting back into the tree line like smoke dissolving in wind. Gone. But not defeated. They would be back. Muhyol knew it, and the wolf knew it. He pulled the arrow from the snow and told Dalsu to start building a fence. The next morning, the settlement began constructing a perimeter wall. Not stone. They had no time or materials for that. Packed snow and ice reinforced with pine logs from the forest edge. Chest high. Enough to slow a charging animal and give archers time to shoot. Every able body worked. Even the children carried snow in hide buckets. Even the refugees who had arrived half dead a week ago. The wall went up in sections over 3 days. Crude, rough, but functional. Muhyol set a night watch rotation. 2 people at all times walking the perimeter with torches and bows. The wolves did not return during construction. The system showed them holding position 2 leagues northwest, waiting. On the 33rd day, more refugees arrived. 7 this time, from 2 different settlements. They came separately, but with the same story. Village dead, food gone. Heard rumors of a place in the north where a lord hunted the dead forest and fed his people. They had followed the rumor through snow and cold and desperation. Muhyol counted again. 121 mouths. The margin was shrinking. He doubled the hunting schedule. 2 full parties out every day. Seihui's team northeast. His own team northwest. Dalsu managed the trap lines and the fishing hole. Gomtol's processing operation ran from dawn to midnight. The storehouse filled and emptied and filled again in a constant cycle. Muhyol pushed deeper into the forest on every hunt. The system rewarded aggression. New territories revealed, new game signatures. But the deeper he went, the more he noticed something wrong. The animals were moving. Not randomly. They were migrating south, away from the deep forest, away from the north. Something was pushing them. He mentioned it to Seihui on a hunt. She had noticed it too. The game trails all pointed south. Every track they found led away from the deep forest. She said her father had told her that animals knew things before people did. When the deer ran, you should ask what they were running from. Muhyol thought about the massive signature on the system. Closer now, still moving south. And the animals between it and Nungal were fleeing ahead of it, like birds before a storm. On the 35th night, the temperature dropped to something beyond cold. Muhyol had no way to measure it, but the water inside his house froze solid. The air itself seemed to crystallize. Breathing hurt. Moving hurt. The fires in every house burned at full intensity, and still the cold pressed in through every gap and crack. 3 of the elderly fell ill, fever despite the frozen air, coughing that would not stop. Tubei said it was the winter sickness. It came every year when the cold reached its worst. Last year, it killed 11 people. Muhyul looked at the sick and felt the weight of every life in the settlement pressing down on his shoulders. Meat could not cure disease. Warmth could not fix everything. But warmth and food gave bodies the strength to fight. He ordered extra rations for the sick, thick broth, rendered fat mixed with dried herbs Tubei knew from the old medicines, hide blankets layered 3 deep. He sat with the worst case through the night. An old woman named Chunhua, who had been in Nungul longer than anyone. Her breathing was shallow, and her skin was gray, and her hands clutched the blanket with a grip that said she was not ready to let go of this world. She survived the night. All 3 did. But the message was clear. Winter was not finished with them. Food and shelter and walls were not enough. The cold itself was the enemy, and it was getting worse. The 38th day brought the first death since Muhyul's arrival. Not from hunger, not from cold, from the forest. A man named Pilsu from one of the refugee groups had volunteered for the hauling team. He was strong and willing and eager to prove his worth to the settlement that had taken him in. The hunting party killed 2 deer that morning in the northeast sector. Standard hunt, clean kills. The haulback was routine until Pilsu stepped off the trail to adjust the drag rope and the ground gave way beneath him. A snow bridge over a hidden ravine. He fell 15 feet onto frozen rock. Junwan heard the crack from 30 paces away. They pulled him out with ropes, but his leg was shattered below the knee, bone through skin, blood on the white snow. They carried him back on the sled instead of the deer, and Muhyul worked on the wound with Tubei's guidance. The old man had set broken bones before, but this was beyond setting. The bone was splintered. Infection would come within days in these conditions. Pilsu died on the 40th morning, quietly, in his sleep. The fever took him overnight, and by dawn his body was already cold. His wife sat beside him and did not speak and did not cry. She had walked 5 days through snow to reach Nungul, and her husband had survived starvation and blizzard and wolves, only to die from a hidden hole in the ground. Muhyul helped dig the grave. The frozen earth fought every strike of the pickaxe. It took 4 men 2 hours to break a hole deep enough. They buried Pilsu wrapped in deerskin, and Tubei said words that Muhyul did not listen to because he was staring at the tree line, thinking about every step he had not checked and every trail he had not scouted. The system could show him animals. It could not show him every crack in the earth. 1 death. In 40 days, that was remarkable by any measure. Tubei told him so that evening. He said last winter 23 people died by this point in the season. Muhyul heard the numbers, but they did not help. He had promised himself he would not lose anyone. The promise was broken now, and the weight of it sat in his chest like a stone. He buried the feeling and went hunting the next day. The forest demanded it. 120 mouths did not pause for grief. On the 42nd day, the system revealed something new. Not game, a structure. Deep in the forest, nearly 3 leagues north. The overlay showed it as a geometric shape among the organic signatures of trees and terrain. Straight lines where nature made none. A building, or the remains of one. Muhyul stared at the overlay for a long time. No one in Nungul had mentioned any structures in the deep forest. As far as the settlement knew, nothing existed north of the tree line but endless wilderness. He decided to investigate alone. Sehui argued. She said going 3 leagues into unknown forest without backup was suicide. He told her he needed her to lead the hunts while he was gone. She stared at him with an expression that was equal parts anger and worry. Then she said if he was not back by nightfall, she was coming after him.
He left at first light, moving fast through familiar territory, past the ravine where they had killed the boar, past the frozen lake where Sehui had shot the elk, into forest he had never entered. The trees here were ancient, enormous. Their trunks were black with age, and their branches formed a canopy so dense that almost no snow reached the ground. The floor was a carpet of frozen needles and ice. The cold was different here. Not the biting, wind-driven cold of open ground. A still cold, a patient cold, like standing inside a tomb. The system guided him north. The structure grew clearer on the overlay as he approached. Not large, maybe the size of a house. Stone walls partially collapsed, a roof that had fallen in long ago. He reached it after 2 hours. A ruin, built from cut stone that did not match anything in the region. The blocks were smooth and fitted without mortar. Ancient work, far older than Nungal or any settlement Muhyol knew of. The walls that still stood were covered in ice crystals that caught the dim light and threw pale blue reflections across the interior. He stepped inside carefully. The floor was stone. Beneath the ice and debris, he could see carved lines, a pattern, concentric circles radiating from a central point. At the center, a stone pedestal rose from the floor, about waist high. On its surface, something was carved, characters he could not read, not the common script of Solhan, something older. The system reacted. The overlay flickered and pulsed in a way Muhyol had not seen before. New information scrolled across his vision. Ancient hunting shrine, pre-kingdom era, function unknown. And then a quest notification. Investigate the source of the Great Winter. The shrine holds knowledge of the deep forest. Muhyol ran his fingers over the carved characters. The stone was ice cold, but something hummed beneath the surface. A vibration so faint he was not sure he felt it at all. The system pulled more data from the shrine. Partial translations appeared, fragments. The words spoke of a balance, the forest and the cold, something that kept them in harmony, and something that had broken that harmony 5 years ago. 5 years, the exact duration of the Great Winter. Muhyol stepped back from the pedestal. The massive signature on the system pulsed, not at the edge of range anymore, closer, much closer. And for the first time, the system gave it a classification. Guardian class entity. The thing in the deep forest was not just an animal. It was something else, something connected to the shrine and the carvings and the unnatural winter that was killing the kingdom. He left the ruin and headed south at a pace just short of running. The forest felt different around him now, watchful. The trees seemed to lean inward. The silence had weight. He made it back to Nungal by mid-afternoon. Sehui was waiting at the tree line. She looked at his face and asked what he found. He told her he found an old ruin. He did not tell her about the carvings or the system quest or the guardian entity. Not yet. Some knowledge was too heavy to share before he understood it himself. That night, he sat by his fire and studied the system overlay. The guardian signature had stopped moving. It held position roughly 4 leagues north, between Muhyol and whatever had broken the balance of the forest. The Great Winter was not natural. Someone or something had caused it, and the system was leading him toward the answer, one hunt at a time. But first, he had to keep 120 people alive long enough to find it. On the 45th day, the rumor became a road. Muhyol counted the tracks from the southern ridge and saw what Tubei had warned him about. A trail was forming in the snow. Beaten down by feet, dozens of people had walked this path in the last 2 weeks, heading north toward Nungal. The word had spread further than he expected. A Saito settlement on the edge of the dead forest where a lord hunted game that no one else could find, where people ate meat and wore fur and did not die. In a kingdom where entire provinces were starving, that rumor traveled faster than any messenger. 8 more refugees arrived that morning. The next day, 12.
The day after that, 6, including 2 children, carried on their father's back because they were too weak to walk. Mu-hyul fed them all. He turned no one away. Tubei stopped arguing about the numbers. The old man had seen the look in Mu-hyul's eyes when a mother carried a frozen child through the gate, and he understood that math would never win that argument. By the 48th day, Nungul held 146 people. The storehouse was under pressure. 3 weeks of reserves had dropped to 10 days. Mu-hyul responded the only way he knew. He hunted harder. 3 parties out every day now. His own team pushing northwest into territory where the boar herds roamed. Seihui's team working the northeast deer trails. A third team, led by Dalsu, focused entirely on trap lines and the fishing hole. The system strained to keep up with the demand. Every morning, Mu-hyul studied the overlay and planned routes that would yield the most meat in the least time. Efficiency was survival. Wasted hours meant empty stomachs. He started training new hunters from the refugees. Anyone who could draw a bow or carry a spear. Most were farmers or laborers with no forest experience. He taught them the basics: how to move through snow without exhausting yourself, how to read wind direction, how to stay quiet, how to kill clean. Some learned fast. A young man named Dokgo from the southern refugees turned out to have steady hands and sharp eyes. Within a week, he was shooting almost as well as the brothers. Others struggled. A woman named Un-bi could not bring herself to make the killing stroke. Mu-hyul told her that was not weakness. He put her on the processing team instead, where her careful hands made her the best hide worker after Gomtol. The settlement expanded physically. New houses went up on the eastern side, not built from scratch, but reconstructed from the collapsed structures using timber hauled from the forest edge. Crude, cold, but standing. Gomtol directed the construction between his forge work, and the man slept maybe 3 hours a night and never complained. The perimeter wall extended to cover the new housing. The night watch doubled from 2 to 4. Mu-hyul had not forgotten the wolves. The system showed the pack still holding position northwest. 7 signatures. Waiting. Learning patience from the winter itself. On the 50th day, Mu-hyul took Seihui and the new hunter Doko on a deep hunt. The system had revealed a second elk herd near the frozen lake. 3 animals. If they could take even one, the meat would buy a week of breathing room for the strained storehouse. They reached the lake by mid-morning. The elk were on the far shore, exactly where the system placed them. But something was wrong. The animals were agitated. The bull paced back and forth along the tree line. The cow and juvenile huddled close together. Their breath came in rapid clouds. Mu-hyul scanned the system overlay. Red signatures, 4 of them. Wolves. Not the Northwest Pack, a different group, smaller, hungrier. They were circling the elk from the deep forest side, driving them toward the lake. The wolves were hunting the same prey. Mu-hyul made a decision in 3 seconds. He told Seihui and Doko to hold position on the eastern ridge. He moved fast along the northern shore, putting himself between the wolves and the elk. If the wolves drove the elk south across the ice, he would lose them. If he drove the elk east toward his hunters, they might get a shot. The bull saw him and froze. 2 threats now, wolves behind, man ahead. The animal chose the lesser danger and bolted east along the shore. The cow followed. The juvenile stumbled after them on legs too young for the deep snow. Seihui's arrow took the cow at 40 paces. Doko shot at the juvenile and missed. The bull crashed into the forest and vanished. The 4 wolves burst from the tree line and saw the fallen cow and the 3 humans standing over it. They stopped. Yellow eyes, raised hackles. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then Mu-hyul shouted and slammed his bow against a tree. The sound cracked through the frozen air. The wolves turned and dissolved into the forest. But they had been close, 10 paces from Doko. The young hunter's hands were shaking, and his face was white. Seihui was calm. She had already begun gutting the cow. 260 pounds of elk. They loaded it onto the sled and hauled it south. Muhyol walked rear guard the entire way, watching the system for red signatures. The wolves followed at a distance for an hour, then turned back. That night, the settlement ate well, but Muhyol sat in his house and studied the overlay with growing concern. The wolf packs were multiplying. The original 7 northwest, now 4 more near the lake. The deep forest was pushing predators south, just like the prey. Whatever the guardian entity was, it was displacing everything in its path. The forest was emptying from the north, animals and predators alike fleeing south toward the narrow band of territory where Nungle's hunters operated. For now, that meant more game. Soon, it would mean more danger. He needed to go back to the shrine. The answers were there. But leaving the settlement for a full day meant hunts that did not happen and mouths that did not get fed. The weight of 146 lives pressed down on every decision. He could not chase the mystery of the Great Winter until his people were secure enough to survive without him for more than a day. He was not there yet. On the 53rd day, Muhyol made the hardest decision since his arrival. He told Seihui she was in charge of all hunting operations, not temporarily, permanently. She would plan routes and assign teams and decide targets. He would still hunt, but he would no longer lead every party. She stared at him for a long time. Then she asked why. He told her the settlement needed him for other things, and she was ready. The second part was true. The first part was a half-truth. He needed time to go north, to reach the shrine again, to follow the system's quest before the guardian entity reached them. But Seihui did not need to know that yet. She accepted the role without ceremony. Her first act was to reorganize the hunting teams. 3 permanent groups of 4 with rotating rest days. Each team had a lead hunter and a tracker and 2 haulers. She drew up schedules and assigned territories and posted them on the storehouse wall. The system she built was better than Muhyol's, more structured, more sustainable. She had been watching him for weeks, and she had learned not just how to hunt, but how to manage hunters. Muhyol watched her work and felt something shift. The settlement did not need him to survive anymore. It needed him to grow. And to do that, he had to understand what was killing the North. He left on the 55th morning, told Tube he was scouting deep forest for new hunting grounds, not entirely a lie. He moved fast through the familiar zones, past the Boar Ravine, past the Elk Lake, into the ancient forest where the trees blocked the sky. The shrine appeared through the trees exactly as he had left it. Stone walls, ice crystals, the carved pedestal at the center. But something had changed. The ice on the floor had melted slightly. A thin film of water covered the stone carvings. In the dead of winter, in the deepest cold of the great forest, the temperature inside the shrine was above freezing. The system overlay surged the moment he stepped inside. Information flooded his vision faster than he could process. The carvings on the pedestal glowed faintly. Not light exactly, something the system translated as energy. Old energy, stored in the stone for centuries. The partial translations from his first visit expanded. More fragments assembled into meaning. The shrine was a waypoint, one of several built along a path that led deeper into the forest, north, toward the heart of the Great Winter. The builders had been hunters, not ordinary hunters, guardians of the forest who maintained the balance between the wild and the human world. They hunted not for food, but for equilibrium. When predator populations grew too large, they culled. When prey vanished, they found the cause. When the forest sickened, they went to its heart and healed it. The system recognized their work. It was built on the same principle: hunt, provide, protect the balance. The translation spoke of a cycle,
The forest breathed in long rhythms, cold seasons and warm seasons that lasted decades, not months. The Guardians managed these transitions. When winter pressed too hard, they went to the source and eased it back. When summer scorched, they did the same. Balance, always balance. 5 years ago, something broke the cycle. The translations were damaged here. Ice had cracked the stone, and some characters were lost. But the fragments told enough. The guardian of the deep forest had been corrupted, or wounded, or driven mad. The entity that once maintained the balance had turned. Instead of regulating winter, it was amplifying it, pulling cold from somewhere deeper and spreading it outward year after year. The great winter was not weather. It was a wound in the forest that bled cold instead of blood. The system updated the quest. Follow the waypoint path north. Find the source. Restore the balance. And a warning. Guardian class entity. Hostile. Current distance 3 leagues north. It was closer than the last time he checked. The entity was not just moving south, it was following the same path Muhyil was following, converging on the waypoints, on the shrine. Muhyil left the ruin and headed south. His mind worked as his legs moved. The Guardian was connected to the winter. Kill it and the winter might end. Or it might not. The translation spoke of restoring balance, not destroying. The old hunters healed the forest. They did not butcher it. But a corrupted entity 3 leagues away and closing was not something you healed with good intentions. He needed to be stronger. His hunters needed to be stronger. And the settlement needed to be able to stand on its own when he finally went north for the answer. He returned to Nungul by late afternoon. Sehui met him at the perimeter. Her teams had brought in 2 deer and 14 hares. The storehouse was stable. The system she built was working. He told her about the shrine. Not everything. He told her there was an ancient structure in the deep forest that might explain why the winter would not end. He told her the forest was sick, and something in the north was making it worse. She listened without interruption. Then she asked if he was going to fix it. He said he was going to try. She nodded once and said she would keep everyone fed while he did. That night, the system pulsed with a new alert. Not from the north, from the south. Human signatures. A large group moving toward Nungul from the southern trail. Not refugees. The formation was too organized, too deliberate. Military spacing. Someone with soldiers was coming. Muhyil stood at the window of his house and looked south into the darkness. He did not need the system to guess who it was. The rumor of a thriving settlement in the dead north had reached more than desperate refugees. It had reached the ears of men who sat in warm fortresses and considered everything in their province to be their property. Namelord Cho Gyolbin had heard about Nungul, and he was coming to collect. They arrived on the 57th day, 40 men on horseback, well-fed, well-armed, wearing thick fur-lined coats and carrying steel that gleamed in the gray winter light. At their head rode a man in a black coat trimmed with silver fox fur, Cho Gyolbin, Namelord of the northern province, the man who administered the territory from a heated fortress 3 weeks south, while the settlements under his authority froze and starved and died. Muhyil had never met him, but he recognized the type instantly. Soft hands, hard eyes. A man who measured the world in what he could take from it. Diorbin's company rode through the southern approach and stopped at the perimeter wall. The Namelord looked at the wall, and his expression shifted. Surprise first, then calculation. A settlement on the edge of the dead forest was not supposed to have walls. It was not supposed to have smoke rising from 40 chimneys. It was not supposed to have people standing at the gate in proper fur clothing with bows in their hands and meat on their breath. Muhyil walked out to meet him, alone. Tubei and Sehui and the hunters lined the wall behind him, but Muhyil went forward by himself. The Namelord looked down from his horse. He did not dismount. A man on a horse talking to a man on foot. The hierarchy established before a single word was spoken. Gulbin said he had come to inspect the settlement. As provincial namelord, all communities in the Northern Territory fell under his administration, and he was concerned about reports of unauthorized activity. Muhyul noted the word, unauthorized, surviving without permission, eating without approval. The namelord's eyes moved past Muhyul to the settlement behind him, the smoking racks visible above the wall, the storehouse with its sealed door, the people standing firm in the cold without shaking. He asked how many people were in the settlement. Muhyul told him 146. Gulbin's jaw tightened. He said the last census recorded 40 households and roughly 90 souls. Muhyul said refugees had come from settlements that had perished, Baruhan, others further south. Gulbin asked where the food was coming from. Muhyul said the forest. Gulbin looked at the dark tree line to the north. He said the forest was dead. No game for 3 years. Every report confirmed it. Muhyul said the reports were wrong. Something passed across the namelord's face then. Not anger, fear. A man who controlled the north through scarcity had just discovered that scarcity was no longer absolute. If one settlement could feed itself from a dead forest, the entire power structure of the province shifted. Gulbin needed the north to be desperate. Desperate people obeyed. Desperate people did not build walls or wear furs or stand at gates with bows. He composed himself quickly, a politician's reflex. He announced that as provincial authority, he was imposing a resource levy on Nungal. 50% of all hunted game would be collected by his agents on a weekly basis. The meat would be redistributed to the province as the administration saw fit. Redistribution. Muhyul understood the word. It meant the meat would go to Gulbin's fortress and his soldiers and his allies, while the settlements that needed it continued to starve. He told Gulbin no. The word landed like a stone in still water. 40 armed men shifted on their horses. The namelord's expression hardened. He said the levy was not a request. Provincial law authorized him to collect resources from any settlement in his territory. Refusal was rebellion. Muhyul looked at the 40 soldiers. Then he looked at the wall behind him. Sehui stood on a raised platform with her bow drawn and an arrow nocked. Not aimed at anyone, just ready. Beside her, Doko and the brothers, and 15 other hunters stood with weapons visible. Behind them, 130 civilians stood in the cold. Not hiding, not cringing, standing. Muhyul spoke calmly. He said the province had sent him here to die. The province had abandoned Nungal and every settlement north of the timberline. No food was sent, no soldiers for protection, no officials to govern. The people here survived because they fed themselves. The game they hunted belonged to the forest, and the forest belonged to those who walked it. He said the levy would not be paid. The silence stretched. Gulbin looked at the wall and the hunters and the settlement behind them. Muhyul watched the calculation happen behind the namelord's eyes. 40 soldiers could take Nungal, probably, but at a cost. The hunters on the wall were not trained warriors, but they were fed and armed and fighting for everything they had. And even if Gulbin won, he would destroy the only source of food in the Northern Territory. He would burn down the one place that could actually produce what he wanted to take. The Namelord made his decision. He said Muhyul was making a grave mistake. He said the provincial authority would not forget this defiance. He said there would be consequences. Then he turned his horse and rode south. 40 soldiers followed. The settlement watched them go. When the last rider disappeared over the southern ridge, Tube exhaled a breath he had been holding for 10 minutes. He said that was not a victory. That was a postponement. Muhyul agreed.
Gyolbin would be back, with more soldiers, with legal authority from the capital, with whatever it took to crush a settlement that had dared to say no. They had weeks at most, maybe less depending on how far south the Namelord had to go for reinforcements. Muhyol called a council that evening, every adult in the settlement. He told them what was coming. He did not soften it. The Namelord would return with force. They could submit and give up half their food, which meant slow starvation for 146 people. Or they could prepare. Saihui spoke first. She said they had survived the forest and the wolves and the cold. She said she was not going to hand her food to a man who had left her father to die in the snow. The room agreed. Not with cheering, with the quiet, hard resolve of people who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. Muhyol laid out the plan. Strengthen the walls, stockpile weapons, train every able body in basic defense, and hunt. Hunt harder than ever. Fill the storehouse until it could not hold more, because when the fight came, they would need reserves that could outlast a siege. The settlement moved with purpose the next morning. The wall grew higher. Gomtal's forge came alive for the first time since Muhyol arrived. They had no coal, but they had charcoal made from hardwood, and they had bone and antler and salvaged iron from collapsed buildings. The big man hammered spear points and arrowheads from before dawn to after dark. The sound of his hammer rang across the settlement like a heartbeat. Muhyol stood at the northern wall and looked toward the forest. The guardian entity pulsed on the system, 3 leagues north. The mystery of the great winter waited. But the threat from the south was immediate and human, and it would arrive with swords. The forest would have to wait a little longer. The next 12 days were the hardest since Muhyol's arrival, not because of cold or hunger, because of time. Every hour split between preparation for war and the relentless demand of feeding 146 mouths. The hunting teams pushed themselves to exhaustion. Seihui's 3 groups rotated without rest days. They brought in deer and boar and hare and fish, and the storehouse swelled, but the numbers were never comfortable. A growing settlement devoured reserves as fast as they accumulated.
Muhyol trained defenders in the mornings. 32 men and women who could hold a spear or draw a bow. He taught them formation, how to stand on a wall and shoot downward, how to brace a spear against a charge, how to fight in snow, which was nothing like fighting on solid ground. Every step was uncertain. Every swing threw your balance. The snow was a weapon for whoever understood it best. Seihui proved more valuable in defense training than in hunting. She could shoot from any position, standing, kneeling, lying flat on a wall top. She taught the other archers to aim for gaps in armor at close range. Throat, armpit, inner thigh. Places where fur and leather did not cover. Dokgo became her best student. The young man had a natural calm under pressure that most veterans envied. He could knock and draw and release in the time it took others to raise their bows. Gomtal produced weapons at a rate that seemed impossible for one man. Spear points, arrow bundles, 2 short swords hammered from salvaged iron, crude but sharp. He reinforced the gate with iron bindings and built a second barrier behind it so that breaking through one would only reveal another. The wall rose to chest height on a standing man, and Muhyol had the defenders pack the top with loose snow that could be kicked down onto attackers to blind and slow them. On the 63rd day, scouts reported movement on the southern trail. Not the Namelord yet, something worse in its own way. 3 families from a settlement called Huangso. 15 people, including 7 children. Huangso had been raided by marauders 3 days ago. Everything taken. Houses burned. The survivors fled north on the only road they knew. Muhyol took them in. 161 people.
The storehouse math tightened another notch. That evening, Tubei sat with Muhyol by the fire in the storehouse. The old man's face showed every one of his years and several more that the winter had added. He said something Muhyol did not expect. He said the other settlements that had sent refugees to Nungol were not all dead. Some were barely alive, clinging to existence with no food and no leadership. He said there were maybe 200 people scattered across the Northern Territory, in pockets of 5 and 10 and 20, all slowly dying. If Muhyol could reach them, if he could bring them in or send them food, he could save them too. Muhyol closed his eyes. 200 more. The number was staggering. But the old man was right. Those people were dying because no one was looking for them. The same way Nungol had been dying before Muhyol arrived. He told Tuba that first they had to survive the Namelord, then they would reach out. The old man nodded. He understood priorities, but the knowledge of those dying settlements sat in the room like a guest no one could ask to leave. On the 65th day, Muhyol went north. He could not wait any longer. The guardian entity had moved again, 2.5 leagues now, closer every week. The temperature across the entire region had dropped another degree, and the forest game was shifting further south. If the entity reached Nungol's hunting territory, the game would flee entirely, and no amount of walls or weapons would save a settlement that could not eat. He told Seihui he was scouting for 2 days. She gave him a look that said she knew he was not just scouting, but she did not argue. He reached the shrine in 2 hours, moved past it, north, into forest no human had entered in years. The system overlay blazed with information, game signatures everywhere. The deep forest was not empty, it was overfull. Animals driven south had bottlenecked against the territory of the guardian entity and packed into the zone between it and the hunting grounds. Deer, elk, boar, wolves, bear, an entire ecosystem compressed into a narrow band of forest. And at its northern edge, the guardian. Muhyol pushed closer. The cold intensified with every step north. His breath froze on his scarf. The moisture in his eyes crystallized. The trees here were coated in ice so thick they looked like glass sculptures. Nothing moved. The animal signatures on the system stopped abruptly at an invisible line. Beyond it, nothing lived. A dead zone. A circle of absolute cold radiating from the guardian's position. He reached the edge and stopped. The system screamed a warning. Temperature beyond survival threshold. Do not proceed without preparation. He could feel it. The cold beyond the line was not weather. It was force. It pressed against his skin like a physical wall. His torch flame shrank to a blue point and nearly died. Through the ice-coated trees, he could see something. A shape. Massive. Dark against the white. It stood in a clearing half a league ahead. The system overlay could barely resolve it at this distance. Guardian-class entity. Species unknown. Estimated mass, 4,000 pounds. It was enormous. Larger than any animal Muhyol had ever seen or heard of. A creature of the deep forest. Ancient, powerful, and radiating cold like a sun radiated heat. The system offered more data. The entity was wounded. Not physically. The overlay showed a corruption in its pattern. A dark spot at its core, like rot in the heartwood of a tree. The translations from the shrine connected. The guardian had been corrupted, poisoned by something, and the poison made it bleed cold into the world. An endless winter pouring from a wounded god of the forest. Muhyol stared at the shape through the frozen trees. The old hunters had healed creatures like this. The waypoint path led to the guardian, not to destroy it, but to restore it. But the shrine translations were incomplete. He did not know how to heal a corrupted guardian. He did not even know how to survive in its presence long enough to try. He turned south. The warmth returned in slow degrees as he left the dead zone. By the time he reached familiar forest, his hands had stopped shaking. He made camp near the Elk Lake and slept for 4 hours. Dreams of ice and enormous dark shapes moving through white silence. He returned to Nungal on the 66th evening. Seihui reported 2 successful hunts and no incidents. The wall was nearly complete. Gomtol had finished a 3rd short sword. Everything was as good as it could be. Muhyol sat alone and thought about the Guardian. 4,000 pounds of wounded ancient power bleeding winter into the world. And somewhere south of him, a petty name lord gathering soldiers to take by force what hunger could not. 2 enemies, one of ice and one of iron. He would have to face them both. The name lord came on the 70th day. Muhyol saw them on the system before the scouts reported. A column of signatures moving north along the southern trail. More than before. He counted from the wall as they crested the ridge. 80 soldiers. Double the first visit. Mounted, armed with steel swords and spears and crossbows. Behind them, 3 wagons. Supply wagons. Kjolben had come prepared for a siege if necessary. The name lord rode at the center of the column. Same black coat, same silver fox trim. But his face was different. The first visit had been an inspection, a tax collector checking his accounts. This was punishment. Muhyol positioned his defenders. 34 fighters on the wall. Seihui and 12 archers on elevated platforms. Doko at the gate with a spear and the calm, empty expression of a man who had already decided he was not running. The brothers Junwan and Junha guarded the flanks. Behind the wall, the civilians waited. Women and children and elderly packed into the central houses. Quiet, afraid, but not broken. Kjolben halted his column 50 paces from the wall. He did not speak first. An officer rode forward instead, a captain with a voice trained for carrying orders across battlefields. He announced that Kang Muhyol was charged with defiance of provincial authority and unlawful seizure of crown resources. The game in the forests of the Northern Territory belonged to the province. Hunting without levy payment was theft. The penalty was forfeiture of all stored provisions and submission to provincial governance. Muhyol stood on the wall and listened. He looked past the captain at Kjolben. The name lord sat his horse with the rigid posture of a man who expected obedience and had brought enough steel to enforce it. Behind him, 80 soldiers waited, professional, disciplined, men who ate regularly and trained regularly and followed orders without question because the man who paid them kept their bellies full. Muhyol's 34 defenders were hunters and farmers and refugees. Half of them had held a weapon for less than 2 weeks. The math was ugly. He knew it. Kjolben knew it. Everyone standing in the snow knew it. Muhyol spoke. He did not raise his voice. He said the province had abandoned the north 3 winters ago. No food shipments, no soldiers, no governance. The settlements had been left to die, and they had died. Baruhan, Hwangso, a dozen others, gone. Nungal survived because its people fed themselves from a forest the province had declared dead. The levy Kjolben demanded would kill 161 people as surely as a sword. He said he would not allow it. Kjolben rode forward past his captain, close enough that Muhyol could see the veins in his neck and the controlled fury in his eyes. He said Muhyol was a convicted exile, a disgraced officer stripped of rank and title and sent north to serve out his sentence. He had no authority, no standing, no rights. The fact that he had survived was an inconvenience, not an achievement. He gave Muhyol 1 hour to open the gates and surrender all provisions, or he would take them by force.
Muhyol did not respond. He stepped down from the wall and gathered his council. Tubei, Sehui, Gomtol, Dalsu, Dokko. 5 people standing in the snow behind a wall of ice and logs, facing 80 armed soldiers. Tubei spoke first. He said fighting was death. 80 trained soldiers would overwhelm 34 hunters, even behind walls, even with bows. The casualties would be catastrophic. Seihui spoke next. She said surrender was also death. Slower, but just as certain. Without their food stores, the settlement would starve within weeks. Every person Muhyol had saved would die anyway. Gomtol said nothing. He held a hammer in one hand and a short sword in the other, and his silence was its own answer. Muhyol looked at each of them. Then he told them his plan. Not a battle plan, something else entirely. He walked back to the wall and climbed up and called to Gyolbin. He invited the Name Lord to inspect the settlement personally, to see the storehouse and the smoking racks and the hunting operation with his own eyes. He said if Cholbin understood what Nungul had built, he might see an opportunity more valuable than a single levy. Cholbin hesitated. The invitation was unexpected. He consulted with his captain. Then he dismounted and walked toward the gate with 6 guards. Muhyol opened the gate and let them in. The Name Lord walked through Nungul in silence. He saw the storehouse stacked with smoked meat and preserved fish and rendered fat. He saw Gomtol's workshop producing tools and weapons from bone and antler and salvaged iron. He saw the hunting teams returning from the forest with fresh game. He saw children in warm fur clothing eating real food. He saw a settlement that was not just surviving, but functioning, producing, growing, something the rest of his province had not done in 3 years. Muhyol walked beside him and said nothing until they reached the northern wall. Then he pointed at the forest. He told Kilbin that the forest was not dead. That game still lived in its depths and could be hunted by those who knew how to find it. He said Nungul could feed not just itself, but the surrounding territory, the refugee settlements, the dying pockets of survivors scattered across the north. He said the province did not need to take from Nungul. The province needed Nungul to produce, and production required people who were fed and free and had reason to work, not serfs stripped of their harvest. He said Kilbin could ride home with half their meat and watch Nungul collapse within a month, or he could ride home with a trade agreement, meat and hides in exchange for tools and iron and seed grain for spring, a partnership that fed the province instead of bleeding it. Kilbin listened. Muhyol watched the calculation happen. The Name Lord was greedy, but he was not stupid. A dead Nungul gave him 1 shipment of meat. A living Nungul gave him a supply line. And a supply line in a kingdom where provinces were starving was worth more than gold. The Name Lord agreed. Not warmly, not with respect, with the cold efficiency of a man who recognized a better deal when he saw one. He named his terms. A 30% share of all hunted game delivered monthly to the provincial seat. In exchange, he would supply iron stock and grain, and official recognition of Nungul as a self-governing hunting settlement under provincial charter. Muhyol countered, 20%, and the charter would extend to any settlement that joined Nungul's hunting network. Gyolbin's eyes narrowed. He understood what Muhyol was building. Not a village, a territory. A power base that would grow with every refugee taken in and every hunter trained. He agreed to 25%. Muhyol accepted. They shook hands in the snow between the storehouse and the wall. 80 soldiers watched from outside the gate. 34 hunters watched from inside. Both sides understood that the handshake was temporary, a truce, not a peace. Kilbin would honor the deal as long as it benefited him, and not a day longer. And Muhyol would use every day that deal bought him to grow stronger. The Name Lord rode south that afternoon.
His wagons carried the first payment, 25% of the storehouse. It hurt to watch that meat leave, but it bought time, and time was what Muhyol needed most. That evening, he stood at the northern wall and looked into the forest. The system overlay showed the guardian entity, 2 leagues north, still closing. The truce with Kjolben had bought him room to breathe. Now he could turn his attention to the real enemy, not the Name Lord, not the cold, the wounded thing in the heart of the forest that was bleeding winter into the world. He would need to go north again, deeper this time, past the dead zone, past the wall of killing cold, to the Guardian itself. The system pulsed with the quest, restore the balance. He did not know how, but the forest had been teaching him since the day he arrived, how to find life where others saw death, how to feed the hungry from the bones of winter, how to turn a graveyard into a home. Maybe it would teach him this too. Muhyol spent 3 days preparing. He studied every fragment the system had translated from the shrine. He mapped the dead zone around the Guardian and calculated how long a human body could survive in that cold. The answer was not encouraging. 20 minutes at the outer edge, less than 10 at the core. Beyond that, the blood thickened and the heart slowed, and the body simply stopped. He needed protection. Gomtal built it, a suit of layered armor made from every hide the settlement had. Elk skin on the outside, boar hide beneath, rabbit fur against the body. 3 layers sealed with rendered fat to block wind. A hood lined with wolf fur taken from a lone predator Dalsu had trapped 2 weeks ago. Mittens double-layered with sinew-stitched seams. Boots packed so thick with dried grass and fur that Muhyol could barely bend his ankles. He looked like a walking animal when he put it all on. Gomtal stepped back and studied his work with a critical eye. He said it would keep a man alive in the worst cold he had ever seen. Muhyol told him this cold was worse than anything anyone had ever seen. The big man shrugged and said then it would keep him alive a little longer than nothing. Muhyol packed provisions, smoked venison, rendered fat wrapped in hide, a flask of bone broth sealed with wax, enough for 2 days. He took his best bow, the one Gomtal had built from ash and bone with a pole strong enough to punch through elk hide at 40 paces, 20 arrows, his hunting knife, a torch soaked in tallow that would burn even in wind, and a pouch of coals wrapped in layers of dry bark to relight it if the flame died. The night before he left, Seihui came to his house. She sat across the fire from him and said nothing for a long time. Then she told him she knew he was not going on a scouting trip. She said she had watched him study the northern forest for weeks. She said she had seen the way the animals fled south, and the way the cold deepened every night, and the way Muhyol looked at the tree line like a man staring at something only he could see. She asked him what was out there. He told her, all of it. The shrine, the waypoints, the guardian entity corrupted and bleeding winter into the world. The system quest to restore the balance. The dead zone where nothing survived. She listened without moving. When he finished, she was quiet for a full minute. Then she said she was going with him. He said no. She said it was not a request. He told her the dead zone would kill her. The cold beyond the boundary was not something fur and willpower could survive. She told him that he was planning to survive it, and he was made of the same flesh she was. He almost smiled. He told her the settlement needed her. If he did not come back, Seihui was the only person who could keep 161 people alive through the rest of winter. The hunting operation depended on her. The defense depended on her. If both of them went north and neither came back, Nongol would die within a month. She stared at him across the fire. Her eyes were bright and hard, and something behind them cracked for just a moment before she sealed it shut again. She told him to come back. He said he would try. She stood and walked to the door and stopped. Without turning around, she said her father went into the forest one day and never came back,
and she found his bow in the snow and nothing else. She said if Muhyol did the same, she would go north and drag his body home even if it killed her. Then she left. Muhyol stared at the closed door for a long time. Then he checked the system one final time. The Guardian was less than 2 leagues north.
Almost on top of the second waypoint shrine. The dead zone had expanded. Animals were fleeing south in waves now. The hunting territory was shrinking. If he waited another week, there would be no game left within reach of Nungal. The timeline had collapsed. Tomorrow or never. He slept for 4 hours, dreamless. The fire burned low and the cold crept in and he let it. Tomorrow he would walk into worse. He left before dawn on the 74th day. The settlement was dark and quiet. Only Tubei was awake, standing at the northern gate with his swollen hands clasped in front of him. The old man did not ask where Muhyol was going. He already knew. Muhyol had told him the night before. Everything. The shrine, the guardian, the quest. Tubei had listened and nodded and said that the forest had always been more than trees and animals. His grandmother had told him stories of the old hunters. Guardians who walked the deep woods and spoke to the things that lived there. He said he thought they were just stories. Now he was not sure. Muhyol passed through the gate and Tubei gripped his arm. The old man's hand was trembling, but his grip was iron. He said Nungal would be standing when Muhyol returned. Muhyol nodded and walked north. The familiar forest passed quickly. He moved at a pace that burned through his reserves, but covered ground fast. The Boar Ravine, the Elk Lake, the first shrine, all landmarks now. Way stations on a path that led to the heart of a dying forest. He reached the second waypoint by mid-morning. Another stone ruin, smaller than the first. The carvings here were clearer, less damaged by ice. The system translated rapidly. Instructions. How the old hunters approached a corrupted guardian. Not with weapons, with offerings. The forest demanded balance. To heal the guardian, you had to give something back. The old hunters brought the finest kill they could find. The greatest beast of the forest, taken at the peak of their skill. They laid it before the guardian as proof that the hunter understood the cycle. Life taken from the forest returned to the forest. The kill was not payment. It was language. The only language the guardian understood. Muhyol read the translations and felt something click into place. The system had been preparing him for this from the beginning. Every hunt, every kill, every level gained and skill unlocked. Not just to feed a settlement, to make him worthy of standing before the guardian and speaking its language. He needed a kill. The finest he could manage. Something from the deep forest that would prove his mastery. He checked the system overlay. The dead zone was close, less than a league north. But between him and the boundary, the compressed animal population teemed. And among them, one signature burned brighter than the rest. An elk. Massive. The system classified it as an alpha bull. Estimated weight 500 pounds. The largest single animal in the forest. It stood alone in a clearing, half a league northeast. Muhyol changed course. The forest here was dense and dark, and the cold bit through even Gomtol's layered armor. He moved with every skill the system had taught him. Silent steps, wind awareness, reading the terrain for sightlines and cover. The elk appeared through the trees like a vision. Enormous. Antlers spread wide as a man's outstretched arms. Dark brown coat, thick with winter fur. It stood in a patch of weak sunlight that had broken through the canopy, and its breath rose in steady clouds. The most magnificent animal Muhyol had ever seen. He nocked an arrow. The bow creaked. The elk's ears turned. Muhyol stepped out from behind his tree, and the elk saw him. For a moment, they stood facing each other, hunter and prey, the oldest relationship in the world. The elk
did not flee. It watched him with dark, liquid eyes that held no fear, only recognition. It knew what he was. He drew and released. The arrow flew true and struck the elk behind the left shoulder. The animal staggered, took one step, then folded its front legs and sank into the snow with a grace that made Mu-hyol's chest tight. He reached it quickly. The elk was still breathing, shallow, fading. He knelt beside it and placed his hand on its neck. The fur was warm. The heartbeat slowed under his palm. He waited until it stopped. Then he closed the animal's eyes with his thumb and sat in the snow beside it for a full minute in silence. The system registered the kill. Alpha elk, maximum tier. Offering quality confirmed. He gutted the animal and fashioned a drag harness from rope and branches. 500 pounds. He could not carry it. He could barely drag it. But the Guardian was less than a league north, and the ground sloped downhill toward the dead zone. He pulled. Every step was agony. The snow fought him. The weight fought him. His shoulders burned and his legs screamed, and sweat soaked through every layer of fur and froze against his skin. He pulled for an hour. The temperature dropped steadily. The trees grew coated in ice. The light changed. Dimmer. Bluer. The dead zone. He crossed the boundary and the cold hit him like a fist. Even through the layered armor, it found the gaps. His fingers went numb first, then his feet. The torch in his pack would not stay lit. The tallow flame guttered and shrank to a blue point, and he tucked it inside his coat against his body to keep it alive. The system overlay showed the Guardian ahead. Close now. Half a league. The dead zone was silent. No birds, no wind, no sound at all except the scrape of the elk carcass dragging through ice-crusted snow and Mu-hyol's own ragged breathing. The trees here were dead, frozen solid. Their bark had split and their heartwood was exposed and coated in frost so thick it looked like bone. A graveyard of ancient giants, killed by the cold their own Guardian was pouring into the world. He pulled for another 30 minutes, and then he saw it. The clearing was vast. A circle of dead trees surrounding an open space maybe 200 paces across. At its center, the Guardian stood motionless. Mu-hyol stopped breathing. It was a beast beyond anything the system had prepared him for. Shaped like an elk, but wrong. Too large, too old. Its antlers rose from its skull like a crown of white bone, spreading wider than the tallest trees at the clearing's edge. Its fur was white, not winter white, the white of ice itself, of glaciers, of the void between stars. Its eyes were open and they were blue. Not the blue of sky or water, the blue of the coldest flame, the blue of absolute zero. It stood perfectly still. Frost radiated from its body in visible waves. The ground beneath its hooves was not snow. It was solid ice extending outward in a perfect circle. The source of the great winter. A god of the forest, bleeding cold into the world from a wound Mu-hyol could not see. The system overlay showed the corruption clearly. A dark mass at the center of the Guardian's chest, like a tumor of shadow nestled against its heart, pulsing, growing, feeding on the Guardian's power and converting it into endless winter. Mu-hyol dragged the elk carcass into the clearing. The cold was beyond anything he had experienced. His vision blurred, his heartbeat slowed. The layered armor was failing. He had minutes, maybe less. He pulled the offering to the center of the clearing and left it 10 paces from the Guardian. Then he stepped back and knelt in the snow. The old hunters did not approach as conquerors. They approached as servants of the forest. He knelt and the system pulsed with a light brighter than anything it had ever produced. The Guardian moved. Its massive head turned. Those blue eyes found Mu-hyol, and he felt the weight of centuries pressing down on him.
the gaze of something ancient and powerful and in terrible pain. It looked at the elk carcass, the offering, the finest kill of the forest's finest hunter. Then it looked back at Muhyol, and something shifted in those frozen blue eyes. Recognition. The same recognition the alpha elk had shown. Hunter and guardian. Two halves of a cycle that had been broken for 5 years. The system translated what happened next, not in words, but in understanding. A flood of knowledge that bypassed language and went straight to the core of Muhyol's being. The guardian had been corrupted by something that came from outside the forest. A darkness that had crept in through the deep roots of the world and lodged in the guardian's heart like a splinter of shadow. It fed on the guardian's power and twisted it, turned warmth to cold, balance to excess. The guardian could not remove it alone. It needed a hunter, someone bonded to the forest through the old covenant of kill and offering, someone the system recognized as worthy. The knowledge showed Muhyol what to do. He stood. He walked toward the guardian. The cold intensified with every step until his body screamed and his vision went white at the edges. He reached the guardian and placed his hand on its chest. The fur was not cold. It was beyond cold. It was the absence of all warmth. His hand should have frozen instantly, but the system blazed around him like a shield. Golden light pouring from the overlay and into his palm and through the guardian's hide to the corruption beneath. He felt it, the dark mass, writhing, fighting. It did not want to be removed. It clung to the guardian's heart with hooks of shadow and poured cold into Muhyol's arm. His fingers turned white. Ice crystals formed on his skin. The cold climbed his wrist toward his elbow, and he felt his blood slowing and his thoughts dimming. He pushed harder. The system gave him everything it had. Every hunt, every kill, every life saved, every mouth fed, the accumulated weight of 74 days of refusing to let the winter win. The golden light burned brighter, and the corruption screamed. Not a sound. A vibration that shook the clearing and sent cracks racing through the ice on the ground. The dark mass contracted, shrank. Muhyol felt it losing its grip. He pulled, like pulling a splinter from flesh, slow and agonizing and necessary. The corruption came free, a mass of shadow and cold that writhed in his hand for one instant before the system's light consumed it. Gone. Burned away like frost in sunlight. Muhyol collapsed. His hand was frozen solid from fingertips to wrist. The pain was extraordinary. He lay in the snow at the guardian's feet and watched the world change. The blue left the guardian's eyes, replaced by something warm, dark gold, the color of autumn sun through forest leaves. The frost radiating from its body slowed, stopped. The ice beneath its hooves began to crack, and above them, through the canopy of dead trees, something impossible happened. The clouds shifted, thinned. A shaft of sunlight, real sunlight, warm and golden and alive. It broke through and touched the clearing, and the snow began to melt. The guardian lowered its head. Its breath washed over Muhyol, warm for the first time in 5 years of endless winter. The massive antlers cast shadows in the new sunlight, and the ice on the dead trees began to crack and fall in sheets that shattered on the softening ground. Muhyol lay in the snow and cradled his frozen hand against his chest. The pain was a distant roar beneath the shock. He could not feel his fingers, could not move them. The system overlay dimmed to a faint pulse, exhausted, like the tool itself had given everything it had. The guardian stepped forward and pressed its muzzle against Muhyol's ruined hand. Heat flooded through the contact. Not fire, something deeper, the warmth of deep earth, of underground springs.
of the living heartwood of ancient trees. The ice in his flesh began to thaw. The pain surged, and he bit down hard enough to taste blood. Then it faded. Feeling returned in slow waves. His fingers tingled, then burned, then moved. He flexed them one by one, stiff, damaged, but alive. The guardian withdrew. It stood over him, and the gold in its eyes held something that the system translated simply as gratitude. Then it turned north, toward the deep forest, toward the heart of the woods where it had walked for centuries before the corruption found it. It took one step, and the ground beneath its hoof bloomed. Not flowers, not in the dead of winter. But the ice retreated. The frozen earth softened. A circle of thawed ground spread from the hoofprint like a ripple in water. The guardian walked north, and everywhere it stepped, the killing cold pulled back. Muhyol watched it go, the massive white shape moving between the ancient trees, growing smaller with distance. The forest swallowed it. But the warmth remained. He stood slowly. His body was wrecked. The cold had taken more from him than just his hand. His muscles ached. His joints screamed. Every breath rattled in his chest. He had pushed further than a human body was meant to go. The drag harness lay empty beside the elk carcass. The offering. The guardian had not taken it. Perhaps the offering was the gesture, not the meat. He left it in the clearing and turned south. The walk back was the longest of his life. Each step required deliberate effort. His legs did not want to carry him. His vision blurred and cleared and blurred again. But the forest around him was changing. He could see it even through the haze of exhaustion. The ice on the trees was thinning. Water dripped from branches. The dead zone was shrinking, receding northward like a tide pulling back from shore. Animals appeared. First distant signatures on the system, then actual movement. A fox darted between trees to his left. A bird called from somewhere overhead. The first birdsong Muhyol had heard since arriving in Nungul. He reached the first shrine by late afternoon, rested there for an hour. The stone building was warmer inside now. The ice on the walls had melted, and water pooled on the carved floor. The concentric circles on the ground seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. The system overlay flickered, and a final translation appeared. Balance restored. The cycle resumes. Winter will recede. The forest will heal. Muhyol read the words and closed his eyes. 5 years of unnatural cold. Thousands dead across the kingdom. Entire provinces starved and frozen. And the cause had been a splinter of darkness in the heart of a wounded god. He pushed south, past the Elk Lake where the ice was already thinner, past the Boar Ravine where water trickled beneath the snow cover, through the familiar hunting grounds where every tree and trail was mapped in his memory. The forest was waking up. He reached the tree line north of Nungul as the sun touched the western ridge. Real sun, low and red and warm on his face. The clouds had broken for the first time in months, and the sky above was pale blue, streaked with gold. He stood at the edge of the forest and looked down at the settlement. Smoke rose from every chimney. The perimeter wall stood solid. People moved between the houses, small figures in fur coats going about the work of survival. 161 lives that had been sentenced to death by winter and politics and indifference. Still alive, still working, still fighting. Because one man had refused to lie down in the snow and die. Seihui saw him first. She was on the wall, scanning the tree line as she had done every hour since he left. She saw the figure emerge from the forest, and she froze for one heartbeat. Then she was running. Through the gate, up the slope, through the snow. She reached him and stopped 3 paces away. Her eyes scanned him. The exhaustion, the damaged hand, the ice still clinging to his coat.
She asked if he did it. He said yes. She looked at the sky, the blue, the gold, the sun that had not shone like this in 5 years. Her jaw tightened and her eyes filled, and she blinked once, hard, and it was gone. She stepped forward and put her shoulder under his arm and took his weight and walked him down to the settlement. The news spread in minutes. The sky told the story before Muhyil could. People came out of their houses and stood in the evening light and looked up at the breaking clouds and the warm colors they had forgotten existed. Tubei stood in the center of the settlement with tears running freely down his cracked face. He did not try to hide them. He had earned every one of them. That night was the warmest Nungal had known since the Great Winter began. The temperature did not drop below freezing for the first time in years. Water dripped from rooftops. Snow softened and settled, and the drifts that had buried the settlement began to shrink. People sat outside around fires that they did not need for survival, just for light, just for the comfort of flame in the company of others. Muhyil told them what he had found, the guardian, the corruption, the cure. He told them the winter would not end overnight. Years of unnatural cold could not be undone in a day. But the source was healed. The cycle would resume. Spring would come. Not this week, not this month, but it would come. And when it did, the seeds they planted would grow, and the rivers would flow, and the forest would fill with game that no longer fled from a wounded god's endless cold. Tubei asked what came next. Muhyil looked at the faces around the fire. Sehui, Gomtol, Dalsu, Dokko, the brothers, the refugees from Baruhan and Huangso, and a dozen other dead settlements. People who had walked through snow and starvation to reach a place where someone was willing to hunt for them. He told them what came next was the same thing that came every day since he arrived. They would hunt. They would build. They would take in everyone the dying North sent to their gates. They would grow from one settlement into a network. Nungal and the villages around it, linked by hunting trails and trade routes, and the shared knowledge that the forest was not their enemy. The 200 people Tubei had told him about, the scattered dying pockets across the territory, they would find them, every one. He said the Namord's agreement gave them legal standing. The charter recognized Nungal as self-governing. They would use that. Expand the charter to cover every settlement that joined them. Build something the province could not ignore and could not crush. Not a rebellion, a foundation. The strongest community in the North, built on the simplest principle. Feed people, protect them. Teach them to feed and protect themselves. Sehui asked about the lord who had exiled him, the enemy at court who had sent him north to die. Muhyil looked south. Somewhere beyond the snow and the mountains and the frozen rivers, a man was sitting in a warm room, waiting for news that Kang Muhyil had finally perished in the cold. That news would never come. Instead, a different message would arrive, that the exile was alive, that the graveyard he was sent to had become the strongest settlement in the north, that the man they buried had risen and brought an entire dying territory back to life. Muhyil said the revenge would come, not by his hand, by the weight of what he had built. A man who fed 161 people through the worst winter in memory did not need a sword to destroy the reputation of those who had thrown him away. The truth would do the work. He looked at the sky one more time. Stars were visible, faint, distant, but present. The first stars Nungal had seen through clear sky in years. He went inside and sat by his fire and studied the system overlay. The Guardian's signature glowed gold in the far north. Calm, steady, healed. The forest stretched out beneath the overlay in signatures of life. Animals returning to territories they had fled. The ecosystem uncoiling from its long frozen contraction. and Nungal at the center, a point of warmth and light and stubborn human refusal to die. The system pulsed with a final notification. Primary quest complete. Balance restored. New quest available. Build the Northern Territory. Expand the hunting network. Prepare for spring. Muhyul closed his eyes. For the first time in 74 days, he slept without planning tomorrow's hunt. Tomorrow would come on its own. And when it did, he would be ready.